What I'm about to explain is not just another update in an ongoing conflict. It is a signal that the entire balance of global power may already be shifting in real time. China has issued a direct warning to President Trump regarding any potential blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. But what makes this warning so important is not just the message itself, but the exact way it was delivered. According to multiple reports, Chinese officials made it clear, if you touch our energy lifeline, we will respond. Those words are not casual diplomacy. They are carefully chosen, measured, and loaded with meaning. If you touch is not negotiation language. It is a red line. It signals consequence, not discussion. And when this kind of language comes from one nuclear power directed at another, it immediately raises the stakes of every decision being made in the Gulf. To understand why this matters, you have to look beyond Iran, beyond the Strait of Hormuz, and even beyond the current military tensions. What is really being tested here is something much larger. Whether the United States can still act alone in shaping global events, or whether we are now entering a world where other major powers will directly intervene to protect their survival interests. If China follows through on what it is suggesting, it would mark a major shift in how international power works. For decades, the global system has operated under a clear assumption. The United States has the final say in major security and trade routes, especially in critical regions like the Middle East. That assumption is now being challenged in a very direct way. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. A huge portion of global oil shipments passes through it every day. For China, this is not just a trade route, it is a lifeline. Around 40% of China's imported energy comes through the Persian Gulf, and nearly all of it depends on that narrow passage staying open. Now imagine what happens if that flow stops. Not for a day or two, but for weeks. China's factories would slow down first. Then entire industrial regions would face shortages. Cities could experience power instability. Transportation systems would begin to break under pressure. Food supply chains, which depend heavily on fuel and fertilizer, would also come under stress. This is why China is reacting so strongly. From Beijing's perspective, this is not about politics or alliances. It is about survival. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a battlefield or is effectively shut down due to military action, China does not see this as a regional issue. It sees it as an existential threat to its economy. And that is the key point. China is now openly signaling that it will not accept a situation where decisions made in Washington can directly determine whether its economy functions or collapses. That is the foundation of this warning. What makes this even more significant is that China has traditionally avoided direct confrontation with the United States. For decades, its strategy has been based on economic growth, gradual military development, and avoiding open conflict with American power. But this warning suggests that approach is changing. The question now is not whether China prefers confrontation. It clearly does not. The question is whether China feels it has any alternative left. Because when a nation believes its economic survival is at risk, even long-standing strategies can shift very quickly. And that is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. What we are witnessing is not just a political message. It is the beginning of a potential turning point in global power dynamics, where economic dependence is starting to translate directly into military signaling. And once that shift begins, it does not stay limited to one region. It spreads. To fully understand why China is taking such a strong position, you have to look at the level of dependence involved here. China does not issue warnings like this lightly. Its entire foreign policy, over the past several decades, has been built on avoiding direct confrontation with the United States, while steadily growing its economic and military strength in the background. But the Strait of Hormuz changes everything. China imports a massive share of its energy from the Persian Gulf, and that supply line is not optional. It is essential. Without it, China cannot sustain its current level of industrial production. This is not a short-term inconvenience. It is a structural vulnerability at the core of its economy. So when Chinese officials say, if you touch our energy lifeline, they are not speaking in abstract terms. They are referring to a very specific chain of consequences. Any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz immediately translates into fuel shortages, production delays, and economic pressure across the entire country. From China's point of view, this creates a dangerous situation where its national survival is indirectly influenced by military decisions made by another power. And that is something no major country is willing to accept indefinitely. This is why China's warning carries so much weight. It is essentially saying that if American actions in the region continue to threaten this energy flow, China will not remain passive. Now, what does "we will respond" actually mean? That is where the situation becomes more serious, because China is intentionally not defining its response. That ambiguity is not accidental. It is strategic. It allows China to keep multiple options open while increasing pressure on the United States. The first possible response is economic retaliation. China has significant tools in global trade and finance. It could restrict exports of critical materials like rare earth elements, which are essential for American technology and defense industries. It could also reduce purchases of U.S. government debt, which would increase borrowing costs for Washington. It could limit access for American companies operating in Chinese markets, which would directly affect global corporations. It could also disrupt supply chains that many industries in the United States rely on heavily. However, this type of response is not without cost. Because global economies are deeply interconnected, any major economic retaliation would also damage China. It would slow trade, reduce exports, and create instability in global markets. So while this option exists, it is not a perfect solution for either side. The second option is indirect military pressure, specifically through Iran. China could increase support for Iran by providing advanced systems, intelligence cooperation, or economic assistance. This would make it harder for American operations in the region to achieve their objectives. It could also support Iran diplomatically at international institutions, blocking or weakening resolutions against it. This allows China to increase pressure on the United States without directly entering the battlefield. The third option is far more serious. It involves direct military presence in the region. If China were to deploy naval forces to protect its energy shipments, it would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. American actions in the Strait of Hormuz would no longer involve only regional actors. They would risk direct contact with Chinese forces. That is where the situation becomes extremely unstable. Because once two nuclear powers are operating in close proximity in an active conflict zone, the risk of miscalculation increases dramatically. And history shows that even small incidents in such environments can escalate quickly beyond anyone's control. To understand the seriousness of China's position, it is important to look at how rare this kind of signaling actually is. China has spent decades carefully avoiding direct military confrontation with the United States. Its rise has been based on economic expansion, not open conflict. But now, that strategy is being tested by a situation where economic survival and strategic control intersect. If China believes that its energy supply can be disrupted at will by American military action, then it faces a fundamental problem. It must either accept vulnerability or take steps to eliminate it. And that is where military considerations begin to enter the picture. One of the most dangerous possibilities is direct military intervention. This would mean Chinese naval forces operating in or near the Strait of Hormuz to protect energy shipments heading to China. In practice, this could involve escorting tankers, challenging blockades, or establishing a visible military presence in the region. The purpose of such action would not necessarily be war, but deterrence. It would be designed to signal that any attempt to block Chinese energy flows would come at a direct cost to American forces as well. However, this is also the scenario most likely to lead to escalation, because when military forces from two major powers operate in the same contested area, the risk of accidents, misidentification, or rapid escalation becomes very real. To understand why China might even consider such a risk, it helps to look at historical precedent. In 1941, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan. At that time, Japan depended heavily on imported oil to sustain its military and industrial systems. The embargo created a situation where Japan faced economic collapse within months unless it secured new energy sources. Japan then faced two choices: accept American demands and lose strategic independence, or take military action to secure alternative supplies. Japan chose war. Now, the situation is not identical today. China is not Japan in 1941, and the global system is very different. But the underlying logic remains similar. When a major power feels that its economic survival is being controlled by another power, it begins to consider all available options, including military ones. From China's perspective, allowing another country to have the ability to shut down its energy supply is not acceptable in the long term. It creates permanent vulnerability. And over time, that vulnerability becomes a strategic liability. This is why the current warning is so significant. It is not just about immediate tensions. It is about China signaling that it is no longer willing to accept a system where its economy can be disrupted through control of a single maritime choke point. And once that position is stated publicly, it changes the assumptions of everyone involved in the conflict. The moment China entered this equation, the entire nature of the conflict between the United States and Iran changed. What was once viewed as a regional confrontation is now starting to resemble something much larger, with global implications. The United States originally operated under the assumption that it could manage the situation in the Gulf without interference from other major powers. The idea was that American naval strength and regional alliances would be enough to control the Strait of Hormuz and apply pressure where needed. But China's warning directly challenges that assumption. If China follows through, even partially on its threat, the conflict is no longer limited to American and Iranian forces. It becomes a situation where every move in the Gulf is being watched and potentially influenced by another global power with its own interests at stake. This fundamentally changes the strategic calculation. The United States would no longer be planning only for Iranian responses, but also for potential Chinese reactions. That adds an entirely new layer of complexity to military planning and risk assessment. There are several possible ways this could unfold. In one scenario, China increases its support for Iran by supplying advanced defense systems, intelligence sharing, and logistical assistance. This would not directly involve Chinese troops, but it would significantly raise the cost of any American military operation. Iran's ability to defend itself would improve, and American forces would face stronger resistance in key areas. The conflict would become longer, more expensive, and more difficult to control. In another scenario, China takes a more visible step by deploying naval assets to the region. This would not necessarily mean direct engagement, but it would create a constant presence near key shipping routes. At that point, every military action taken in the Strait of Hormuz would carry the risk of encountering Chinese forces. Even without direct conflict, the tension alone would be enough to significantly increase the risk of escalation. There is also a third scenario, which is less direct but equally important. China could accelerate its efforts to build alternative energy supply routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. This would include expanding pipeline networks from Russia and Central Asia, increasing overland energy imports, and reducing long-term dependence on Gulf oil. While this does not create immediate military tension, it has long-term consequences. It reduces the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz and weakens the leverage that any country controlling that route currently holds. What all of these scenarios have in common is that they reduce the ability of the United States to act unilaterally in the region. Every option introduces new constraints, new risks, and new actors into what was previously a more controlled environment. And that is the core shift happening here. The conflict is no longer just about Iran. It is about whether global choke points like the Strait of Hormuz can still be influenced by a single power, or whether control over them is now contested by multiple major states. Beyond the military dimension, what is really being tested here is the structure of the global economic system itself. For decades, the United States has held significant influence over global energy flows, largely due to its military presence in the Persian Gulf and its ability to secure key maritime routes. This influence helped shape the modern economic order, including the dominance of the US dollar in global trade. Many countries conduct energy transactions in dollars because global oil markets have historically been tied to regions where American influence is strong. This system, often referred to as the petrodollar structure, has given the United States enormous financial leverage. But that leverage depends on one key condition: stability in global energy routes. If major powers begin challenging control over these routes, that stability weakens. And if China is now signaling that it is willing to act to protect its energy supply, it means the foundation of that system is being questioned. From China's perspective, this is about reducing vulnerability. If energy flows can be disrupted by military decisions, then economic security becomes dependent on geopolitical alignment. That is not acceptable for a country of China's scale. So the response is not just military signaling, it is also structural adjustment. China is already working on diversifying its energy imports, building alternative pipelines, and strengthening overland trade routes that reduce dependence on maritime choke points. If successful, this reduces the strategic importance of regions like the Strait of Hormuz over time. And as that happens, the ability of any single power to use those routes as leverage declines. This shift has broader consequences. If the United States can no longer reliably influence global energy flows, its ability to enforce sanctions or shape global trade decisions also weakens. Other countries will take note. They will begin to reassess their own dependencies and vulnerabilities. Europe, Japan, India, and others may accelerate efforts to diversify energy sources and reduce exposure to geopolitical risks. The result is a more fragmented global system. Instead of one dominant center of power shaping global rules, multiple major powers begin to operate with their own spheres of influence and independent strategies. This is what is meant by a multipolar world. Not one system controlled by a single authority, but several competing centers of power, each protecting its own interests. Such a system is more complex and less predictable. It reduces the ability of any single nation to enforce global outcomes. It also increases the likelihood of friction between major powers, because their interests will not always align. And that is exactly the direction this situation appears to be moving toward. Now, the critical question becomes, how will the United States respond to China's warning? There are a few possible paths, each with serious consequences. The first is to ignore the warning and continue current operations in the Gulf. This would signal confidence and strength, but it also increases the risk that China will feel compelled to act on its threat. That could mean economic retaliation, military support for Iran, or even naval deployment in the region. Each of these raises the risk of escalation. The second option is negotiation. This would involve recognizing that China has legitimate energy security concerns and working toward an arrangement that reduces risk for both sides. It could include agreements on shipping routes, de-escalation measures, or informal understandings about military presence in the region. This approach is more stable but politically difficult. It requires acknowledging limits to unilateral action. The third option is escalation. This means increasing military presence, rejecting Chinese warnings, and reinforcing the position that the United States will continue to operate freely in the region regardless of external pressure. While this demonstrates strength, it also increases the probability of direct confrontation between major powers. At this stage, the most likely short-term response is escalation, followed by gradual movement toward negotiation once the costs become clear. Because sustained confrontation between nuclear powers carries risks that are difficult for any government to justify long-term. Eventually, pressure from economic systems, allies, and military institutions tends to push toward compromise, even if initial positions are hardline. But whatever path is chosen, one thing is clear: the global system is already changing. China's warning over the Strait of Hormuz is not just about one conflict or one region. It is a signal that major powers are no longer willing to accept a system where one country can unilaterally control critical global choke points. Whether this leads to cooperation or confrontation will depend on how these warnings are handled in the coming months. But the broader trend is already visible. The era of uncontested global dominance is fading, and a more competitive and fragmented world order is emerging in its place. And that shift will affect everything from energy prices to global trade to military strategy. The question now is not whether this transition is happening. The question is how the world will adapt to it before the risks become even greater.